Hi, welcome to our podcast. It's going to be a recap of 2020. This is Camille.
This is Keith.
And this is Rosemary. Okay, in this podcast, we're going to be going over three concepts, which is race, deviance, and privilege. And we're going to be talking about the social conflict theory. So let's begin with something that was really big that happened in 2020, which is the Black Lives Matter movement emerging again, with like a big spark happened due to George Floyd's death. We saw a big ignition in that movement, and like for a while on social media, it was kind of flooding my whole platform. Like all I saw was things about Black Lives Matter. So we're gonna begin there. When George Floyd died, we saw a lot of posts on social media about his death. People were really getting angry, and within his city, there were a lot of riots. There was a lot of burning down of buildings because people were angry about the police brutality that's going on in the United States. And that was a form of deviance to show like, hello, we've had enough of what's going on here. And of course, like I'm in support of this movement.
Yeah, I think one of the major things was how present it was on social media. So we were stuck at home. Most of us, at least the ones who follow the government rules for a couple of months, we had nothing to do. So we were really reading, learning about things, being more conscious of what's happening in our society. And one of those was the Black Lives movement. Initially, I thought it was just going to be a trend. People were going to post about it. It was going to go away. But I'm happy to say that we are still talking about it. People are still posting about it, posting statistics that are extremely scary of how much minorities' lives are more at stake than white people's lives. Tyra Jean wrote an article called Black Lives Matter, Police Brutality in the Era of COVID-19. And in that we see that Blacks are 3.5 times more likely than whites to be killed by the police in the US. And this statistic is only a small fraction of what we've seen this past year with George Floyd's death, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and many others who suffered horrible traumas. So did their families. And we are finally hearing about it. It's finally being shown on the media, and they're getting to be heard as they should.
Well, that's the thing about like the Black Lives Matter movement. Black Lives Matter movement in 2020. So obviously it had started, and I believe it was 2013, and from then it had picked up, a good amount of speed. But it really came to, I won't say a peak, but definitely a high in 2020. As Camille said, with everyone being on social media all the time and like being more exposed to what's going on in the world, or like outside of just their daily lives, which has been good and bad. But also, it's just unfortunate the fact that it took all these, murders by the police officers, who of course are here to serve you, are here to protect you, and are doing just the opposite. It's very unfortunate. This is what it took really to be able to bring this to the forefront and to have everyone start to really rally against it. And I'm glad it's happening. Don't get me wrong. But all things considered, like there should be no necessity for a Black Lives Matter movement in the first place. However, we do need it. So I am glad that it exists. It's just that this should be common sense. And the fact that it's come to a point where people are being killed based on their skin color, pardon me, and that's what's taking for people to really wake up and realize that this is stupid, is just kind of ridiculous. And that statistic that you mentioned earlier about African Americans being 3.5 times more likely to be shot it's alarming, to say the least. And I doubt that it's just a 2020 thing. It's been like that for decades at this point. And again, it's good that people are finally really raising awareness for it and are really taking the steps to make sure that they're heard. But that's also after having like silently protested, pardon me, and raising awareness more peacefully after many years, and yet they're still getting flack for being more violent and more active about it.
I mean, the thing to also consider here is, how much change has really happened due to this movement. Like, these people are angry and they're breaking things and they're burning things and they're pissed off, but still we don't see enough change. So what is it going to take for them? Like, what are they going to have to do to see this like super big change, and like their goal was to defund the police, right? And like I completely see where they're coming from. Like racism is embedded within the whole like system as a whole. So like this frustration of like not being able to fix it, must be like absolutely devastating. And like the system is just it is beneficial to people who are privileged, and just is almost detrimental to people who are minorities. And I can see why they need to um like reacting to such like drastic measures, because like they don't have a choice anymore. Like, what choice has they got to like they've been doing peaceful protests and peaceful things since 2013, and still we don't see enough change, and still people that are Black are getting murdered, and still there is not enough change within the police system. So what is it going to take? That's like the question I ask myself. Is like, it's very sad that George Floyd died, but like it's kind of his spark of this movement was kind of a necessity to get the ball moving, and getting people educated on what's happening. Because before the Black Lives Matter movement really sparked in 2020, I didn't know about it, and I wasn't really aware of to what extent the systemic racism is bad. And although it's like super unfortunate, I think it's almost necessary. And it's worth noting that this movement, and due to George Floyd, like the movement has spread internationally. It's no longer just a United States affair anymore. Like, we saw protests in England, we saw protests all among Europe, and we saw protests in our own country as well, Canada, even in our own city, Montreal. So I think that it's time to get educated. It's time to learn about my own privilege. Like, I'm a white woman, and I grew up in a predominantly white area, and it's time for people like me to be educated on like misfortunes that I've never had to have. Like, how am I supposed to know about like systemic racism if it's not targeted towards me specifically? So it's time for people of my ethnicity to finally be educated on what's happening, and to make a change with Black Lives Matter.
I think a lot of people were shocked by the protests and how much violence there was related to it. But as you said, I was not aware before 2020 of the Black Lives Matter movement. And yes, there was violence involved, but they were finally heard. So Defiance did work for this situation. And I think, like you were saying, you grew up with a certain mindset, with a certain perspective, and we see this exact situation in Tyra Jean's article. She mentions how in 2010 there's a study by CNN where white children, they exhibit white bias, while as Black children with Black parents were taught to know stereotypes and be exposed to certain injustices, and that they grew up with a different mentality than white children. And that at a certain degree, we aren't racist by nature. We grew up learning different things, and we have a big influence, and our perspective is based on how our parents see and how those who raised us also see and express themselves.
Well, yeah, like I definitely agree on that point. Um, I know for myself, I am definitely, I identify as Caucasian. I look white. I am basically white. I do have, my father is Egyptian, but at the same time, I haven't had to go through the same struggles that he's had to go through throughout his life. And I'm not going to pretend that just because I'm half Arab, that I'm going to go through the same struggles an Arab individual, pardon me, will go through. Living in Montreal, I've had it pretty good. I've never been randomly stopped by the police. I think the most that's ever happened, and I kind of joke about this honestly, is like when I go to airports, like sometimes on a school trip, as the only one with like a remotely Arab last name, I get like randomly pulled aside for every single check. But that's more, that's just a last name thing. But in most cases, I won't say that I've had to go through the same struggles. And I do think that because I have like half my family being non-white and being a minority group, I've had more exposure to them. But at the same time, I do catch myself sometimes, not playing into, but sometimes, thinking subconsciously these little stereotypes. And then I catch myself doing that. And I'm like, why am I doing that? And while I do agree that we aren't really racist by nature, we are growing up in an environment that subconsciously promotes racism, even though it doesn't want to, it's still something that's an issue that needs to be addressed. And it's really scary. I find that it's just something that's so like insidious. It's ingrained so deep in you that it might not be like a huge problem, and you may not be fully racist, and you might believe that yes, everyone has value, but it's just something to acknowledge within yourself.
I can especially relate to that, like, growing up in a predominantly white area and having two white parents and going to like a really white elementary school and very white high school. Although I grew up in Montreal and there is a lot of multiculturalism, like just the area that I live in is like predominantly white. And when I took a test for it in my philosophy class, we were talking about race from a philosophical perspective. And my teacher sent out this link that was like optional to take a test on whether or not you have a bias. And it was a really, really long test anyway. And I wasn't expecting my results to say like I have a bias, because like I like to think that like I'm a social justice warrior and like I love like every single culture and ethnicity like equally. But my results were that I was slightly more biased to liking white people, and like that was almost a devastating result for me. Like I was almost upset by it, but it just goes to show that perhaps it's not necessarily in our own control, like I don't think that I'm biased, but like maybe in certain instances I am biased. And like that's a sad thing to think, but like to a certain extent, like these statistics have to be true because in my case, they were true. I think also worth noting, I only really like started to see injustice within like our police system when I met my partner, and he would tell me stories that happened to him because he's Arab, so he's a minority group, about like instances that happened to him with the police. And I was like, whoa, like what? Like this has never happened to me. And that just shows a mark of my own privilege and a mark of like, I've walked around my whole life with this privilege on my back just because I'm white. And like that's like really, really sad. And especially when you have someone that you love like equally and you see them like just because they're like of color, maybe like because he's a very, very dark Arab, him like getting like these like misfortunes happening to him from the police, like it's almost heartbreaking why that would happen to anybody, and I think that it relates well to the Black Lives Matter movement, like just because like they have a certain skin color, like they have a lack of privilege, and like that's very, very upsetting. And it's time for us to like move past race and move past ethnicity and like move past this like hierarchy of privilege. Like that it should not be a thing anymore, and like it needs to start to not be a thing anymore. So we need to fix what's happening in our society.
I just think it's almost baffling when you look at what happens with, in the world we live in, there's a lot that's like morally gray, that there's this lot that's confusing, that you don't really have a full opinion on because everyone has different feelings about everything. But when you look at racism, and pardon the saying, but it's very black and white. It should be the most obvious thing. And you're taught, like, at least in our environment, taught like relentlessly in school, racism is bad, racism is bad. I feel like a lot of us know that, but we don't like understand its full extent until later in life. But even then, it it should be something that's just so simple. And that's why this is like such an infuriating just topic to speak of with people, like especially people who are, who they don't admit it, of course, they don't call themselves racist, but they are racist. It should be something that's like super easy to comprehend. That skin color does not define who you are, or your value attributed to you. So this is why I think that a lot of people, and it's very self-centered mindset too, like it's very reflective of privilege that people have, especially see people who are white, have this very like self-centered attitude, and they really think first about how this affects them. And that's why the Black Lives Matter movement is like a threat in their eyes. They have the privilege to say, oh, how is this going to affect me? And like, oh, all lives matter, my life matters too. And like they don't look at the fact that this is a movement not attacking them. Like it's a movement acknowledging like, yeah, your life has value, of course it matters, but we need help. We need help that like desperately right now. For centuries we've been oppressed for literally no reason. But yeah, no, apparently that's just too much for some people to handle. So yeah, it's frustrating. It's very frustrating to see the amount of privilege some people have. But
I think that like the argument with all lives matter movement is like selfish, just because like,
mhm.
you know, the people that are saying all lives matter, like they don't have like systemic issues attributed to their like race, and yes, they don't have like systemic issues attributed to their race, and like it's time to focus on Black Lives Matter. Like it's time to focus on Black people because they have systemic issues, and they're the ones who are suffering, they're the ones who are dying, they're the ones who are getting they're the ones basically asking for basic human decency. Like they're just asking to be safe, and they're just asking to feel safe, like walking on the street. And it's really sad because like as you were saying, Keith, like this I don't know, I'm not sure why this reminds me of what you were saying, but like just like let's say like you're not a visible minority because you're half Arab, right? So you're not a visible minority. Like if you walk on the right, people just make the assumption that you're white. And let's say that wasn't the case, then you would be more attributed to seeing like racist remarks or getting more confronted by the police, which shouldn't be the case.
Should
I think
not.
that's where like the Black Lives Matter movement matters so much, just because like these are like people who are just trying to walk on the street and just try to do everyday things, and they're always getting like stopped because of the way that they look.
Yeah, what you're saying, like, oh, sorry, actually a little side note. I shouldn't feel lucky that I came out looking more white. Like I shouldn't have to feel lucky about that. That's messed up. That I'm glad that my mother's genetics account like came out a little bit over. And like not that I'm at all ashamed of my like Arab heritage. It's just knowing how I would have been treated. I am grateful, but I shouldn't have to be. It's messed up. But yeah.
I was going to mention how COVID-19, how this whole pandemic has so many links to privilege, how people don't realize that you have money. If you have enough money, you are able to survive. You can keep paying for rent. You can keep buying your food when you lose your job during this pandemic with stores closing, as well as also from the article I read that um, in the COVID-19 pandemic, um, the death rate is way higher for Blacks in the US population overall. And that also shows how your social class, your background. So if you have enough money to stay at home, not expose yourself, while as if someone has to be working every day or has to go to the hospital to get some money, you are privileged if you are able to be home, have the same food that you had last year. And also touching that, people who do not wear masks, they are also privileged because they choose to not wear the mask, which is deviance, and they aren't aware that they could be putting other people's lives at risk, it being pre-existing conditions, or people that are older And that is extremely selfish from them.
Well, yeah, speaking of like privilege, and that was like what you mentioned was displayed in an article by Evelyn Chicas and al. She brings up an interesting statistic where she interviewed a fixed sample of people, and from different races, and we observe like who is following social distancing rules or like observing social distancing, and who's going to protest, who's wearing their masks. And what's really funny is that we see that a lot of people who are observing social distancing, who are wearing their masks, are predominantly African American women who, when you think about it, in the context of our society, should be the ones who are the most angry at the government for how they're being treated. They're the ones who, by all means, are really getting their lives messed up the most, we'll say. And yet we see the people who are openly defying the government and we're going to these protests. There are a lot of Caucasian men and women who are feeling the right to be able to openly just go against the rules put in place for their own safety, which I believe is very ironic because the people, again, just like I said earlier, have the least right to be angry at the government. And yet they also use the kind of example of these violent protesters and how they're the looters and how they're burning down all these stores, and how if they should be doing these acts of deviance, then they should be allowed to also act these acts of deviance. And they don't seem to make the distinguishment between what's deviance for a good reason, for a cause, and that needs to happen, versus just petty and selfish deviance. And that's really what is the problem is one of the problems, at least, in the United States and the world in general, really.
Well, I think it really marks just, like their privilege, Black people are asking for the bare minimum, which is safety and security and just to live, because they're getting killed by a system that is ruled against them. And people who are predominantly white, who are anti-maskers, are selfish and privileged because they don't want to, help the community and just wear a mask. And we're seeing this a lot, like them entering, like not even just attending protests, but just entering stores without their masks on, and they're getting asked to leave because you have to wear a mask to be served here, and they're having complete and utter fits inside the store. And we see these videos online, and they're absolutely ludicrous. And it's not a big ask to wear a mask, like it's not a big ask to
Nice motto.
covering. It's really not a big ask, and it's really not that big of a sacrifice. And it's almost like ironic to think that this is happening at the same time. Black people are asking, for their right to live, and white anti-maskers are asking for the right not to wear masks. Like, when you look at the comparison, it's almost mind-blowing, and it just shows the level of privilege they have, and also just the anti-maskers in general, like a sense of uneducation they have, which is spread by misinformation being spread among the internet. Like, there's a lot of conspiracies going on about the government's making this virus up, they're putting chips in our masks, the vaccine's going to kill us, the vaccine is like a microchip actually instilled by the government to track us, like all these ludicrous false information that are believed by like these uneducated but privileged people.
I think that all that ties back in also with as I was talking about before, how people think is often influenced by how their parents think. And not to compare Trump as a parent to the US, but he is the one in charge, and he does have racist opinions. He is a privileged white male, and he is deviant. He does not wear the mask. He did not wear his mask for interviews. So that just, we question why everything's going so badly over there, but also the person in charge is doing everything so badly as well. So I think that's also one of the roots of the problems for them.
When you look at some, like a figure like Trump, like he, to a certain extent, is a very good speaker. He's very confident in what he says. He sounds very certain, and people are not fact checking what he's saying. Like when he was at the debate, and even like on his like normal like even when he was like at his normal press conferences, like he was saying things that were just simply not true. Like when we look at the fact check, a lot of things were not true. And, you know, people are not going to go out. Most people don't go out and like research what he's saying. So they just believe him for face value, but he's spreading misinformation about, you know, a lot of things. Not to mention that he's like, he advocates for a sense of deviance by, you know, saying that the coronavirus is not as big as, you know, everyone is saying it is, but he also like condones basically racism. He makes super racist remarks. During his debate, he basically promoted a racist group. I'm not sure exactly sure what the name was, but the following day that group quoted him on, you know, how he like quote unquote promoted them. So, you know, and when you're looking at someone like such high power, like he's the president of the United States, like if you're an American, you're supposed to trust that this person is doing what's best for your nation. This person is telling the truth, he's being transparent with you, and he's telling you what you're supposed to do. So it's easy for people to believe him in a sense without, you know, looking elsewhere for other information.
Yeah, like I think that group was the Proud Boys, I want to say, as the name. But yeah, what you're saying, like he is a man who openly supports a group that is founded on racism, and it should be so clear cut that he's just an awful president. He's an awful human being. He's incompetent at his job. On top of that, so he like really checks off every mark for someone who should, if not get impeached, then not reelected. And I think, I know at least the three of us can all agree that we're pretty pleased with the fact that he did not get reelected, or you know, officially, and that Biden was able to come up on top. But the fact that the election results were so close is honestly like not completely unexpected, but still very disheartening. Like you think it shouldn't be that close, but then you remember all that's going on and the amount of social discord that's going on in the U.S. and it became almost a meme around election season with, oh guys, civil war is coming, get ready. You know, are you like Republican, Democrat, get your firearms, whatever. And it was funny, yes, but also the fact that it was just so like real and like this could happen is just, it's frightening. And that's really why like I find, or at least most of the find, that the US is exemplary of social conflict within itself. It's such a divided nation at this point. And I think that's what contributes to a lot of why racism is so prominent, because some people just don't want to affiliate with each other, or don't want to like try to address each other, which I'm not saying you should accommodate for the other at all, but at the same time, it's so divided that you're allowing each side to kind of like stew in their beliefs, which just leads them to become more strong, more sure of themselves. And that's why racism in the US is just, at least in my eyes, in the near future, in the next like 100 years, not going to die out. Probably not ever, really, but yeah.
In school, we are being taught in the last, I'm hoping the last at least 20 years, that racism is a bad thing, that you should be aware of your privilege. And I'm hoping that in the future generations, people will be more aware of these things and that racism will slowly decrease, and things will be better, things will be more equal, there will be less social conflict.
I was just gonna say, like, when we look at somebody like Trump, like he almost worsened the situation in when we look at the United States, just because like by condoning racism, every single person who was originally had racist ideas and now thinks that expressing those racist ideas are okay and not punishable, because if your president is racist, then you expressing your own racist ideas is perfectly normal because this person in high power is doing it as well. So it just creates more conflict and more like separation within the nation itself. And even when we look, like we're talking a lot about the United States, but these are all issues that we see, you know, internationally and even in our own country and city, you know, like issues of race and issues of privilege and issues of deviance are all things that we see in Montreal as well. Like we saw protests due to Black Lives Matter. We also saw protests in Montreal of anti-maskers, which like to me was almost like an embarrassment to think that people actually went out and, you know, protested against masks in my own city. And, you know, we kind of I think for a long time I kind of turned a blind eye at the fact that there is systemic racism in Canada, because like we like to think of ourselves as almost better than Americans, but that's not the case. Like we have I remember like when the Black Lives Matter movement first started, you know, like there was a lot of focus on the United States, but I remember thinking to myself, like, I need to do my research about like my own country and my own city. And I remember reading articles saying that like Arabs and Blacks within Montreal are more likely to get targeted by the SPVM. And I remember thinking like that's like so disheartening, and it's like it's an issue that's everywhere, and we need to stop it. Like privilege should not be a thing that exists, is basically what I'm saying, and everybody should be equal. And it's time for like this like systemic change, but also the social change.
Yeah, and that's the thing with Canada. A lot of people are like, "Oh, racism is not such an issue in Canada. If it's an issue at all, it's an issue, and it shouldn't be undermined." That's also disregarding. That's beside the fact that we also have the entire like mess that is how we treat Native Americans, Indigenous people in Canada. That is just atrocious. But a lot of people choose to undermine, the same racist issues that are present in the U.S. and think that, oh, it's just worse in the U.S. So don't worry, in Canada, it's just so much better here. If it's here at all, it's not better. If it's here, it's there.
Well, I feel like it's almost a misconception that it's quote unquote better in Canada.
Yeah, totally.
That, you know, politicians and, you know, like people like to paint our nation as better than Americans, or, you know, we're quote unquote nicer than them. But that we still have the issues, and just because they're not like as apparent as they are in the United States does not mean they're not here. And like you said, like the natives, like like that we are worse on that scale, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
It is completely terrible, and you know there is still a lack of action in helping, you know, the poor natives that have had to suffer due to like the expense of, you know, the from the beginning of like the British takeover and the French takeover. Like they have suffered, and I don't think that we have still done enough to, you know, make amends with them, just like we haven't done enough for Black people. And like things need to change, and this is why the Black Lives Matter movement is so important. And I think that we did a really good recap on, you know, its relevance in 2020.
Totally, yeah.
And all the horrible things that have happened in 2020, but at least people's lives such as George Floyd and Breonna Taylor will help us become better as a society, will help us listen to them, will help us put more value to them because we aren't treating them as equals. So yeah, that was a nice little recap. And thank you for tuning in. See you guys next week. We're
signing off. This was Rosemary.
Camille.
And Keith.
We hope you guys have a wonderful day, and maybe, you know, do we sparked you to do research on Black Lives Matter, or just do research about any of the topics we covered, such as race, privilege, deviance, and the social conflict theory we discussed among these theories.